I get to use data to influence design. And that's really what I'm passionate about, right? Is not just designing based on intuition, but actually designing based on the facts and kind of what you're learning from measuring who you're trying to design for. One customer had a lot of different desk shapes and sizes that they had, or kind of configurations that they were testing. And it was very obvious, that the desks, that though they were visually pleasing, like in a circular configuration, we heard from surveys as well as from, it was very obvious in the utilization data that employees didn't like sitting with their back, kind of exposed to the whole office. Yeah, the little details like that, I think, are really important.
Hi, and welcome to BetterWorks People Fundamentals podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Lutzenberger, Senior Director of Product Marketing. BetterWorks' core belief in people fundamentals revolves around helping HR lead through constant change by focusing on core values like fairness, support, balance, and enabling growth opportunities for employees. These tenets empower everyone in the workforce to strive for excellence, to foster creativity, and to acknowledge each other's contributions. BetterWorks believes that strategic HR leaders can translate these principles into action, shaping their workforce for the better and helping drive meaningful business outcomes. And in this show, we're diving even deeper into these principles by listening to experts share how you can make them come alive at your organization. In this episode, I'm joined by Annie Cosgrove, Director of Analytics and Insights at Density. Density is an analytics platform that helps organizations measure and improve workplaces. Annie brings a fascinating perspective on how the way we use space reveals so much about employee experience. She shares surprising data stories like how the shape of a desk can influence collaboration, or how something as simple as bathroom traffic can uncover whether a shared workplace really is supporting employees in their work. We go deep on how design details, from meeting rooms to phone booths, impact productivity and belonging. We also discuss why leaders should use data and listening together to create spaces people actually want to be in. We dig deep into the often overlooked signals that tell us how people really experience the workplace, from the small frustrations that add up over time to the design choices that make collaboration easier. Annie will show us how looking closely at these details can transform the way leaders think about space. If you're curious about how workplace design connects directly to engagement, retention, and culture, this episode is packed with insights you can put into action. Let's dive in. Hi, Annie. It's so good to have you on the podcast today.
Hi, Ashley. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, so I am excited to dig into this episode because there are so many companies that are implementing return to office policies, going from coming in one day a week to 5 days a week. And we often talk about company policies and team cultures being drivers to bring people back into the office. If you have a policy, then people will show up. If you have a strong team culture in the office, people will show up. But I feel like the actual space itself is sort of an under-talked about and really impactful lever that folks can use to draw people into the office, to make them want to show up and want to be there on a day-to-day basis, or something that will just create a lot of frustration and make them want to try and get out of coming into the office as much as they can.
Yeah, totally. There's a ton that we can do to make sure that our workplaces are really welcoming to our employees, and a lot of different, like really helpful data sources that we can use to monitor how it's going. And I think you're right. It's really something to pay attention to. I think ultimately we want people to want to show up to work and to enjoy the work environment in all the ways.
Yep. And I think because this is really a season focused on data, let's talk about the data that you can use to start understanding how do you design spaces and understand if your spaces are designed well for being in the office. So you've got access to detailed space usage data, but there's not always a why behind that behavior. So when you're working with HR teams, you're working with organizations, how do you bridge that gap? How do you surface what is the interesting data points that you're finding, and then guide folks to dig in to understand what is the why behind the behavior that you're seeing that's happening?
Yeah, so like you said, my team at Density has incredible access to like a really objective lens on workplace usage and performance. So Density is an occupancy analytics company, and we use sensors that anonymously track how people use space. And so we partner really closely with which large companies that are trying to understand how their workplaces are performing and really like trying to match their employee needs to their behaviors. And so, yeah, so like you said, knowing how much your space is used and when and for how long and all of the good stuff that we can get from devices like sensors in the workplace, it can tell you a lot about how it's going, but it doesn't give you the whole story. What's really important is pairing sensor data, card swipe data, just sort of measures of how much the space is used and when, with qualitative insights, actually talking to your employees, figuring out the why, like you said, to go along with that. And I think together, these like qualitative and quantitative insights can really give a full picture on how your workplace is doing, what you might need to change, and where there might be pain points for your employees.
Yeah. And so when companies bring employees back to the office, what does your data show that they tend to overlook, and how does that impact culture and retention?
Yeah, so at Density, we've gotten to measure the RTO of several companies and companies who are making big changes or big change to their policy or a big RTO change. Maybe they're going from no days to 5 days in office, or they're going from 3 to 5 days in office. This has been a really common trend, and we've been really uniquely positioned to measure it. And so I think the basics are really important. Like I said, like just generally understanding how much your space is used and what spaces you're running out of and what busy times look like in your space. But I think in general, it's important to look for workarounds maybe that your employees are, so like workarounds that your employees are putting together, or workarounds that they're using to get what they need out of the space. So a big thing that we see and we're tracking generally for companies with our sensors is solo meeting, the occurrence of solo meetings. So how often is there one person squatting in a meeting room, using it for a call? That's an okay use of a meeting room. But how often is there this big mismatch between the number of people in the room and the size of the room, what it's designed for? Solo meetings in particular are really important to pay attention to, because what they often mean is that there aren't the spaces that those employees need to do the work that they need to do. They're either, we're calling them meetings, but it's not necessarily a meeting. They're either in there trying to, get away from the noise and be in a quiet space so they can get their work done and focus, or they're in there because they have a video call and they need a quiet place to take that phone call. So often behaviors, I think it's trying to find the mismatch. Like, we expected the space to be used this way, and this is what we're seeing, and then identifying what would be a better way to address that. And sometimes there are behavioral nudges that can be used to sort of like teach people how to use their space. That's a really important part too of bringing people back to the office, is like that kind of change management or helping people orient to their space and how it should be used. But also finding those moments to change something, or provide it in a different way. So yeah, that's one example.
So do you find that do employees, when they come into the office, need a desk where they can do solo work and need a space where they can actually go to do Zoom meetings or do quiet focused work, where they actually need that sound barrier for whatever reason? Like, are you finding that one person needs multiple types of spaces to actually be effective in the office, or can you actually reduce the number of desks and increase the number of, booth or telephone boxes or meeting spaces? What are you finding is working or not working for organizations as RTOs come into play over the last few years? Yeah,
so it can totally depend, and it doesn't just depend on the company, it depends on the team, right? So it depends on the particular work styles or needs of different functions, right? Like an engineering team might need more, might really need a desk that's dedicated to them so they can do, continuous kind of heads down work. Whereas a sales or marketing team might not need that dedicated space because they're mostly in meetings collaborating. So it depends. It depends on how much your team is going to be in the office. It depends on which teams. And then it also depends on some of it's cultural, right? So we have a lot of customers that have agile configurations. They share desks across their employees, and they're really comfortable with that, and their employees are comfortable with that, and that could be a really efficient use of space. And then we have companies too where they feel that it's important to have that kind of one-to-one person to desk ratio. So someone shows up to work and they know I have my space, I know where I can go, and I know I'm going to have it all day. But there's lots of other ways around that. There's, you can use desk booking systems in order to make sure you reserve a desk. You can, if you're not in full time all 5 days in a week, you can kind of you can change, the demand will change on different days, and you can plan for that. So one of the ways that we look at desk usage at density is not just by looking at if a desk is used or not, but by looking at what kind of behavior happens at that desk throughout the course of the day. And this is really helpful for our customers who are trying to figure out, do we need a desk for everyone? Do we need all these desks? We've worked on a range of problems, a situation where employees coming back to work and they come back to work and they don't have a desk and there's not enough space and they feel like they don't have a place to work I come back and there's nobody here, right? This isn't the experience I wanted. The desks are a ghost town. And so kind of getting the right amount of each space type is really important. And for desks in particular, it's not just whether or not someone used it once that day, but it's, did they use it for continuous periods of time? Did they kind of use it as a coat rack, come in and out throughout the day, or did they, barely touch it, right? And so by quantifying desk usage behavior in that way, we can help our customers or our clients make decisions about really how many do they need, and again, like match that behavior to what they're seeing. This is really important for This is really important for making sure that, especially in the situation of an RTO, that your employees show up and they feel like their needs are being met, right? And sometimes it's not desks. It might be there's a variety of spaces that people need, but knowing kind of what the ratios of those different types of programs should be is really important to a good experience.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really interesting segue, because something that is also becoming more and more commonly talked about and addressed in workplaces is neurodivergence within your employee base, and ensuring that you are setting everyone up to succeed in their home offices or in their physical offices. Are you seeing that different types of spaces in an office cater to different tendencies that people might have or people might be looking for to be able to work in their most efficient and their most comfortable way?
Yeah. So again, like the way that different teams function, different individuals, right, have different needs. And that's where I think the most important thing is having a variety of spaces, having kind of a menu of spaces for people to choose from, but measuring how your spaces are used can help you figure out what are the personas that are really kind of in play here. And so we have a lot of customers that again, provide a variety of different program types. So there's so obviously meeting rooms and desks, but spaces like quiet rooms or libraries where maybe you saw that behavior where people were squatting or kind of hunkering down in meeting rooms to do focus work. If you provide a space where it's the norm is that we're going to be quiet, right, and do kind of like a library setting, then employees know, okay, if I have to, get that project done, I have a place to go, and that gives them comfort. I think especially when coming back to the workplace after being home for a while, where you were kind of completely in control, right, of your environment. So yeah, I think providing a variety of settings and types of spaces is really important. And then again, like tuning the quantities of that based on data is how you can get to a workplace that people really thrive in.
Can you share a story where something seemingly minor revealed something deeper about a workplace experience?
Yeah, so there are lots of things that we measure for our customers who are trying to understand their workplaces and how they're performing. One area that maybe doesn't get as much attention that might be a little surprising is we did a study for one of our big workplace clients on looking at how much their bathrooms were getting used. So density has a couple kinds of sensors, but the sensor that we used for this study was just our entry sensor, which we install at the door to the bathrooms, with a lot of stalls. So it's completely anonymous, and it's just kind of tracking like in and out over the course of the day. So a really simple thing to measure. And it was very interesting because in an analysis looking at all of the bathrooms kind of in the building, we actually found that there were a few bathrooms that were seeing like really high usage patterns at certain times. There was one that was like, whenever there was an event, it would get like many, many visits. And then when there were a couple other ones that, particularly on this one floor, men's rooms were being used a lot more than the female bathrooms. And so sharing this data with our customer and kind of showing them how the different bathrooms were being used based on their location and proximity to different parts of the workplace helped them actually figure out a better cleaning schedule for the bathrooms and address those bathrooms that were definitely, you don't need to go in them to know that they probably need to be cleaned, right? And those are maybe the ones we should pay attention to first. So I think there's a lot of operational efficiency that facilities and operations teams can also really use this data to try to fine tune how the workplace is working. And those little things, like knowing that the bathroom's going to be clean and that the cafe is going to have enough space for you, and you're not, there's a lot of ways that we help our customers understand kind of the amenity spaces as well. And making sure that those spaces are working well is very important, again, to having a good experience when you go to the office.
Absolutely. Tell me a little bit about, so we've been talking a lot about intentionality of space design and then looking at data to understand traffic usage and flows, and then layering on top of that, how often do those places need to maybe get cleaned or get restocked or whatever the question is. But we do also know that culture is another big part of coming back to the office. So tell me a little bit about leadership presence and team culture and how that affects who shows up in the office. What role does management play in shaping successful RTO outcomes?
Yeah, so I think you said it before, like the policy is really important, right? Like you, in order to get people to show up, having a policy in place is a helpful first step. But I think an interesting thing that we did a report on kind of what happens after RTO is that you see occupancy peak in the first week or two, and then really kind of stabilize after that, and is not as high as initially. So it's not just getting people to come back when you make the policy change; it's getting people to keep coming back and want to be there, right? And so having the policy is kind of the first step. But I think we've seen anecdotes, and we don't have a lot of data on this, but we've seen anecdotes where teams that had large companies where we looked at different teams. How much different teams were coming into the office, and the teams where the leader was co-located with the team and also coming in, right? So their kind of upper management was also coming in. That seemed to make a difference. We also know for our own, density, our CEO has done a good job also in our San Francisco office in bringing people in and being really intentional about when people are together. We have core hours in our San Francisco office. So, everyone is expected to be kind of overlapping between 10 and 3. And that's been really useful for, you're a really early morning person, we'll come in kind of early, just make sure you're here for this core time so that we can have our meetings then. And it also gives flexibility for those who have kids or drop off, or pick up, I guess, at the end of the day. So I think the leader being present seems to really make a difference. Again, you want, not even to mention like the mentoring, right, sort of aspect of this and how important it is to kind of have multiple levels. But I think we've definitely seen organizations where leaders are there, it seems like it has an impact. So
that's really interesting. So your background is obviously looking into a lot of data and space utilization, information and analytics, but you also have an architecture background. And so I'm curious what your thought is around this like thoughtful design intersecting with performance and engagement in today's hybrid workforce. Like what design elements do you think really lead to increased engagement from your employees, and what design elements really lead to increased productivity or innovation or outcome, whatever it is that, companies might be driving towards?
Yeah, so like you said, I started my career in architecture, and I ended, I'm at Density now, kind of getting to do my dream job in a way, because I get to use data to influence design, and that's really what I'm passionate about, right? Is not just designing based on intuition, but actually designing based on the facts, and kind of what you're learning from measuring who you're trying to design for. So I think. Going back to you want to create an environment that people want to be in, right? And there are some really, there's removing the friction, any kind of negative experiences. So like making sure that the space that you need is available when you need it, right? We're not when I need to have a meeting of this size, there's a room that's available for that. There's, making sure I have a place to hide and do my focus work. Before I worked at Density, I was at WeWork for 6 years, and WeWork did a really good job of providing kind of the variety of spaces, right? Like, even though I never had a desk, I knew I would have the place I needed, right? Because there was such a variety. It was either that corner on the couch over there, or that phone booth in the back, and I knew, all right, I have this call, I can go, I'll have the space that I need for that. So I think it's about, again, creating a good experience. So removing the pain points, anything kind of negative, the bathrooms were a good example of something that could really detract from your workplace. And then creating a delightful space to be in. At Density, we get to measure, occupancy and how much space is used. And that paired with an understanding of the design or the physical space and the attributes of it can be really powerful for understanding what's working. In some cases, we've looked at the way the location of desks or rooms on a floor in proximity to windows and views, plants. There's a variety of signals. I think that you can use to figure out, again, what's working. And one of those things is in general, creating a space that people feel good in, right? Daylight. We talked a little bit about quiet, but also like noise, a little bit of noise, activity, buzz. There's all these kind of environmental pieces that go into making a place that you want to be. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. Are there any like anecdotes or stories of like when a company designed a space for a specific purpose, but then when folks started to come in and use it, it evolved in a surprising way, not necessarily like beyond just office rooms that became team rooms that became solo offices, essentially. But what else did you ever find any other interesting stories along those lines?
So I guess some of some of our customers are testing out like new types of programs, and we're able to help them monitor or new types of spaces, and we're able to help them monitor if those are being used. So examples are like a communicating stair or connecting stair between multiple floors. How is that impacting usage of the cafe spaces? There are different types of not just like regular conference rooms, but more like casual type conference room setups. I think in the same way that we look at desk behavior, so we look at, how long and in what pattern over the course of the day our space is used. We can also learn a lot from looking at what sizes of groups and also how long of time are people spending together. So not like super surprising, but there's definitely different uses of those different types of meeting rooms. So like more casual spaces are, tend to have kind of like longer brainstorming sessions, whereas we see, kind of more strict 30-minute, 1-hour meetings in more formal meeting rooms. We've looked at quiet spaces quite a bit. I mentioned before libraries, and those have been a little bit. Sometimes you I mean, we definitely can't tell all of it from the occupancy data, but just looking at kind of where people sit and, when do those spaces like fill up? Like how comfortable are people being packed in? Is it too dense? Is it, or a surprising thing about the quiet rooms is we saw at one customer, we saw some evidence of those being used for collaboration. Like that's sort of the opposite, right? So people were always sitting next to each other, like kitty cornered. Again, not the intention of the space, maybe means that they need a collaborative space instead of the quiet space. So or pairing occupancy data with like observation, visiting these spaces, surveying your employees, talking to them, listening to what's working and what's not, can really work well. We've also seen one customer had a lot of different desk shapes and sizes that they had, or kind of configurations that they were testing, and it was very obvious, that the desks that though they were visually pleasing, like in a circular configuration. We heard from surveys as well as from, it was very obvious in the utilization data that employees didn't like sitting with their back, kind of exposed to the whole office. And so, just a little, the little details like that I think are really important.
If an HR leader wants to partner more closely with facilities or workplace teams, or design teams, or whoever else is they're pulling data and information from, what are some shared metrics or projects that really make a difference?
I think that setting the right metrics is really important. Which metrics are right for which team? Again, it's going to depend on what kind of the goals are, but I think defining a set of metrics that does either, kind of reduces a negative experience, that kind of availability issue in the office, or monitors a positive experience, which might be collaboration actually happening in my meeting rooms, or people attending, or the events, or, hanging out in the kitchen at the end of the day. Like I think there are different signals that can help kind of sum up the experience, and especially when you're making a change, having those set up ahead of time and then kind of checking in on them throughout and looking for that like stabilization or even that, what does it look like a few weeks after we made the change? Because sometimes there can be a lag a little bit in terms of what the kind of real situation is going to be. I think having those metrics ahead of time and then checking on them together is a really good way to bring those teams together. And facilities, I mean, like, the different parties that you mentioned, the facilities team can be, or operations team can be better prepped to clean the conference rooms or make sure the event space is ready for, there's a lot of things they can do that can make their lives easier with that data. And then design teams need to hear how what they put into place is performing and know how to iterate. And then I think the HR team, again, like we want, in order to retain employees and to make sure that the whole package is there from them, the workplace is fundamental, right? So you need to there's no question that those teams should be working together. And I think that's sort of the key to I think ultimately moving a company along.
Have you ever had a client where you've looked at the office space that they're going to ask you to start measuring and you already know that it's not going to be a successful office space? Like, are there specific layouts or structures where when you see something is missing or something is there, you already can gauge a sense of how successful the RTO will be?
Yeah, so we spend a lot of time trying to understand what the right mix of space is for behavior in the workplace kind of generally, right? Because we're constantly kind of looking across our portfolio in order to benchmark for our customers. And then we also look specifically at and dive deep on individual offices. And there's some things that are really obvious, right? I think one of the things we've been working on recently quite a bit is developing meeting room programming ratios and guidelines based on actual behavior. So a lot of design guidelines and standards are developed from rules of thumb, which are really like, years of experience, right? Like designing offices. There are rules of thumb for getting to the right ratios of, you need one 20-person conference room for this many for 100 employees or something like that. And so we've been developing behavior-based standards based on what we're kind of seeing in the portfolio. And so it's pretty easy for us, kind of being really familiar with kind of what's best practice right now, to see when a workplace is maybe like way out of whack, right? They may have, sometimes it's that there's way too many of a resource, right? Meeting rooms or desks, and sometimes that it's like way too few. And I think it sort of goes back to like having a mix of space, a variety of sizes and types of environments is really important. And sometimes workplaces, depending on their age, let's say, kind of, there were workplaces that were designed before the pandemic. Most of them, which have been, right, that we're looking at right now, may not quite match anymore. I also think we've maybe over-rotated on phone booths. So sometimes there's way too many phone booths. And so, so just kind of, because we're familiar with, for looking at availability and what happens kind of when all of your meeting rooms are saturated and you're running out of space, like what that kind of threshold is, we can pretty easily see a busy floor with like an inadequately programmed is going to be a problem. And it's only going to get worse when you bring people back. I guess the one exception to that would be that it can be really interesting to see how behavior shifts when there are more people, because sometimes bad behavior is happening just because, like kind of just because you can, right? So a lot of the solo meeting usage of meeting rooms, like if you're in a mostly empty office, you're probably not gonna worry about, I can go in this 10-person conference room by myself for the whole day and pretend it's my office, right? And so in some cases we generally help companies monitor kind of pre and post RTO, like what happens to those different metrics. And sometimes, and in general, like I think that there can be an improvement, and that can be because now we're all here. Oh, we better, let's share, and kind of we'll be on better behavior.
I was just thinking as you were talking about phone booths, it sparked like phone booths are one of my least favorite places to work because, and they're all over. They've been like presented as this great solution to jumping into if you just need to jump in for a Zoom meeting. But the reality is we're often in back-to-back meetings, and those tiny rooms create these microclimates that get really hot really quickly. You've got these stools that are never ergonomically designed. You're on this tiny little ledge so that you can barely fit a laptop on, let alone take notes. And every time I go into one of those, I'm like, this is the worst situation. I would give anything to be back at my desk, like back at home, because like it's just not as comfortable as being in a different space. And so I'm wondering, like, is there any data that says like people hate phone booths? Or is there any data that shows like if you're going to put in a large number of phone booths and you expect people to be in like needing to have private meeting space for, up to 2+ hours of back-to-back time, are different spaces better for that?
Yeah, so we measure a lot of phone booths, so we can look. We know how much they're used, and when our customers run out of them. It can be a little hard for us to tell if like camping is actually happening, like someone's staying because of that back-to-back nature. How like your meeting ends and someone goes in, and because we're an anonymous sensor solution, we don't know who it is, so we wouldn't be able to tell.
You tend to know if like the door got opened or closed.
Yeah, right. So generally we can just see like, all right, these are in demand for the course of the day. I mean, in some ways, maybe the phone booth has kind of been like a Band-Aid solution for offices that were not set up properly for kind of our current work styles, or like where we've gotten to in the last, since the pandemic. I think, imagine if you could take that call or work at your desk, or the environment that you needed was somewhere else, right? And so I think we have a lot of customers that are focusing more on that like 2 to 4 person size, the like focus rooms, and being more intentional about like what the room should be used for. Like, this is a room for calls. This is a room for quiet. This is a room for like one-on-ones. I think there's no question that spending all day in a little box and that they can't be the right, there's going to be better solutions. But sometimes you're escaping, right? This is the only place to go. So
sometimes you just need a moment. Yeah. Sometimes that is the best solution for your 30-minute meeting.
Yeah.
Because if you're like me, maybe you forgot to book a room at the very last minute and they are all full. And so having an overflow space is critical.
Yeah, definitely. But maybe it would be nice if it was like by the windows with plants and there was a couch and and if there's a lot of acoustic treatments that really can make a workplace like easier for people to be taking calls and open. I mean, there's tons of things we can do beyond just like, let's isolate everyone into their own, kind of back to that. Like sometimes we look at the data and it's like, seems like you need a lot of one-person rooms, but it's like, we know that would be going back to, well, why don't you just give everyone an office, which is not the solution. So I also think it's okay for there to be a little bit of like discomfort. And I think we need to be comfortable with that. Like again, it's a transition. When people are coming back to the office, they're used to working at home, they're kind of having used to full control, or they're not used to being at the office as much, right? But if we could just get back to to like all the other reasons we enjoyed being in the office before, I think like that we'll figure it out. So I think maybe like just some advice for leaders is to just it's okay to make changes and it's okay for there to be a period, but I think it's monitoring it closely, right? And making sure that the experience isn't too painful. You don't want to alienate your employees.
Well, I'd love to butt in because what I was thinking about was the story you told earlier about, designing your RTO at density in the San Francisco office around a subsection of time, that 10 to 3 p.m. What that does is it creates this opportunity where you are bringing folks back into the office, but you're allowing a smoother transition. You're allowing being in the office to work around someone's life. So if they need to come in a little bit later because they tend to be a night owl, or if they are a morning person and they need to do a pickup at a certain time, they can come in and come out. They have the right overlap time. But you also create this opportunity where getting into the office doesn't create so many hurdles that you resent the time you're spending in the office. I often also hear from a lot of parents when they do get the chance to go into the office in a low stress way, actually being out of their house and being in a space where they can focus and be in a different environment is a huge bonus. And being able to spend time around other adults and being able to have small talk conversations is actually a huge value add to their day-to-day life. And so making sure that you're balancing, how do you create those opportunities for how being back in an office actually enriches an employee's experience, alongside how do we mitigate the things that make that transition a little bit tough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that flexibility has worked really well for our San Francisco team. I also think you want to have some like control, right? So there's no one likes being told what to do. So a policy being put in place, that can be frustrating because you're going to have to change your behavior. But again, giving individuals some agency around, okay, so I have to be in, but I could come in for these times, or I think that definitely really helps. Yeah. So.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've been enjoying picking your brain, learning more about space design, learning about what the data says, and learning about what spaces are optimized for different experiences in the office. So thank you, Annie, so much for coming in and talking to us today.
Thanks, Ashley. I really enjoyed it. Lots of fun talking about all the things. So thanks so much for having me.
As we wrap up today's conversation with Annie, here are a few things to take back to your own workplace. First, understand the impact of your organization's design space. Annie showed us how choices like desk shape, meeting room setup, and access to private spaces can influence collaboration, focus, and belonging. Second, remember that data is only part of the picture. Understanding how employees use the workplace from data is powerful, but leaders also need to listen directly to people's experiences and perspectives. Third, focus on adaptability. The most effective workplaces are designed to evolve with changing needs, helping employees feel supported no matter how work gets done. By paying attention to design, combining data with listening, and creating flexible environments, you can build workplaces that strengthen both engagement and performance. So be sure to stay tuned for our next episode of the People Fundamentals podcast. Subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube Music. And if you like what you hear, share us with your friends and colleagues. We'll see you again soon.